Welcome everyone, my name is Rich Clark. I am going to talk through deceleration and change of direction for the next few minutes, an area which our understanding of technical models and how to train them is pretty poor, and I'm going to try and highlight a couple of what I consider to be the key core components that are transferable across lots of different actions. So the first thing that I like to do when we start talking change of direction and deceleration is provide some clarity over how the task dictates exactly what type of movement that we see. We see all of these different terms: crossover step, crossover run, a cut, a power cut, a speed cut, a spin cut, a split step cut, all of this stuff which arguably is just the way the body tries to solve a problem based upon the constraints in front of it. I won't go into this in too much detail, but the way I plot it is I put two axes, one looking at the angle of change of direction, i.e. what angle are you turning to relative to the direction you're originally facing, and then our other axis being the movement velocity that somebody is moving at as they begin to initiate that. Bottom left hand corner, starting from static and not really changing angle at all, pretty much a sprint start. Starting from a stop, running straight ahead, as simple as we get. So if we move straight down to the bottom right hand corner, you see we move vertically only very slightly, so only now small angle changes, so moderate changes in running direction, but we're now moving at a really high velocity. So we're probably in an upright sprinting stance, and this is ultimately just an area or just a situation moving fast, needing small angle changes, where we just see cuts and curves. You can add all of the different names into here with different types of cuts or whatever it might be, but the way that I simplify it comes down to what the strides do. Everything in this category either only has one step for braking, one step that initially provides some deceleration and then the following steps are all propulsive, or each step is a combination of propulsion and braking at the same time. So a curve, maybe a curve that occurs in 4 different steps. Each step is doing a little bit of braking and doing a little bit of propulsion to go into the new direction. Whereas a cut, a slightly bigger angle, we might have this initial braking step, this penultimate step provides a bit of deceleration, and then that initial or that following bigger plant step that provides the big redirection comes in following that. And that might still follow with 2 steps to redirect, just like the curve was 4. Sliding scale here, 2 steps, 3 steps, 4 steps, but there's minimal braking taking place, and sometimes that redirection step is doing a combination of different things. So keep that in mind as we try to move forwards. So then we move up to our top left hand corner, and now we have got a situation similar to our sprint start, but it's no longer purely linear. I'm still starting from a very low speed, walking, jockeying, just kind of being at a very, very moderate, very, very controllable velocity. But I'm no longer going directly in front of me. I'm now initiating my acceleration 90 degrees left, 90 degrees right, whatever that might be. And what that does is that means that there is now a directional change, which means that I've got a rotational component, I need to get back into a sprinting position, and those are the kind of things we look for in our technical models. I'm not going to talk about this section very much because I've got this deceleration focus with what I want to go through, and in this kind of category of movements there is no braking component, or if there is, it's very, very minor and it's not a huge influencer on how effectively the movement is performed. So then we move up to the top right hand corner, which is now where we've got a combination of a really high running velocity and a really high demand of angle change. So the task in front of them is forcing them to dramatically change the direction that they're running in. They've potentially got to come to a complete stop and then go fully back into the direction they came from, like a 180 degree turn. But the same expectations are going to apply into something that's maybe closer to 90 degrees, maybe 110 degrees. We're still going to expect to see a much harder braking component. So we're in the bottom right hand corner, we've got this idea of maybe one braking step, or braking is just distributed over lots of strides in a curve. We are now in a position where actually we're going to be up to this point where it's probably 4, 5, maybe even 6 braking steps. That all depends on athlete competency, which we'll talk about in a second, running velocity, and exactly what the angle is. But ultimately what we've got here is if we ignore a sprint start, we've got 3 different categories that broadly have a lot of different change of direction movements in them, and they are all selected because of the intersection between the speed they're moving at, the angle they need to change to. But the way they are executed, the main thing that varies is how strides are used. How many strides produce braking force, how many strides produce propulsive forces, and ultimately how the athlete learns to coordinate to put all of those things together. And for me, that is my most foundational building block. If we want to get somebody who gets somebody better at changing direction and make them adaptable, we need to be making sure that they are capable of braking both while turning left and while turning right, and doing so with the right amount of effort on each stride, so that when they finally come to that plant step to re-accelerate into the new direction, they're in a good position and they exit really, really effectively. That for me is the key skill we need to try and develop, and that's something that I'm going to carry forwards over the next few minutes. So if we look at this situation here, American football is always a great example of these kind of movements in action. We've got a relatively low velocity start, so this initial change of direction is almost like a little bit of a multi-directional initiation, but it starts with a little bit of a roll. It then goes into a relatively hard brake and redirection somewhere around about 90 degrees towards the athlete's left. That's not done at a particularly high velocity, so there's only a very short braking period there. Then the athlete picks up more speed and we see an attempt to start to execute a curve at the point when they begin to get tackled. So we've got 3 different kind of changes of direction on show. Each one is taking place at a different velocity to a different angle and needs slightly different step demands based upon which leg brakes, which leg provides propulsion, etc., etc. And ultimately, this is what is happening in all different situations, just with different demands based upon angle, speed, and what the opposition or what the defenders are really doing. Now, a couple of really important things to keep in mind. The role of deceleration and the role of the braking steps during a change of direction is to optimize the position that the athlete is in when that plant step hits the floor. So when that step that provides that big redirection effort, when that leg hits the floor, the athlete needs to be in the best possible position to exit the most effectively, to exit the most accurately, and to essentially be safe and competent in that movement. And how that position looks depends on all of the strides that come before it. So whether there's 1 braking step, 2, 3, 4 braking steps, how they are managed impacts that last plant step, which has one of the bigger influences on overall risk and on overall performance. But the key thing here is that related to these braking components is that it's about momentum. It's not just about whether they can technically do things, it's also about when they maybe hit these positions, do they reduce their momentum sufficiently so that when that plant step hits the floor, they aren't trying to jam a plant leg in the ground, so right leg into the ground in order to cut to their left. Because if they try and do that where they're still moving way too quickly, there's still too much momentum, the foot's going to hit the ground and the trunk is going to keep going. That provides us a problem, both for injury risk and for performance. So remember that the whole point is trying to optimize how effectively an athlete exits. In a lot of cases, there are examples that are going to be slightly different to that, but we're trying to optimize that plant step for exit. The way we do that is via the penultimate step and the steps prior to that, those braking steps during deceleration. And one of the important things is that we reduce velocity, reduce momentum, so that we can optimize position with the right amount of load to deal with. So I then split this up into 2 key skills, which become my big work-ons in coaching sessions. And that is appreciating that I want all of the steps to help that final position. So what I actually need to try and develop is an athlete's ability to distribute work across different strides. Does the penultimate step do lots and lots of braking so that the plant step can be really stiff and fast? Or do they end up using a strategy where actually the penultimate step doesn't do much and then it's the plant step that tries to do too much? Make that a 3-step motion, and then now you start thinking about the step before it. So I want to teach them the skill of, if you're turning left, then ultimately right leg is going to be a plant step. So therefore, the left step and the right step that precede that need to contribute the right way, do the right amount of effort in order to make sure that that plant step is good and effective. And then when we start to just think about that point of controlling momentum, we have a combination of both thinking about how each stride produces work, how each stride contributes, but also an idea of affordances. And the reason why I bring this in, this starts to open a can of worms here for kind of perceptual understanding, but an affordance is about what the athlete thinks they are capable of doing. So what I'm trying to make sure that the athlete understands is, based upon how fast they are going, how much braking and how much deceleration do they need in order to cut to the angle which they are going to try to attempt to cut to. If they've got well calibrated affordances, or they've got good affordance-based control, based on the way I've described it here, then they will be able to optimally recognize how fast are they going, what does the angle change require, how much braking do I need between now and then. So they understand what they need to do via affordance-based control, and they've also got the physical and coordinative skills to be able to distribute work across multiple strides to make sure that they can actually execute it. Those two things for me are two really important key skills that transfer to all sorts of different change of direction and agility actions. And that is something which I think that we should embed into the vast majority of our on-pitch multi-directional speed-based training. So here we have a couple of video examples of a 180-degree turn, which is things that I did in the recent play practical seminar. A 180-degree turn might not be particularly specific, but that's not necessarily the point. What a 180-degree turn needs is maximal deceleration. It needs a good affordance control to know how much they need to brake to make that plant step effective, and it forces somebody to have to do that, turning to their left and turning to their right. So I think that a 180-degree turn can be used really commonly in lots of different sporting situations to challenge this ability to distribute work across different strides, and for an athlete to understand and learn or develop their own affordance-based control. Now this example, the athlete in blue, is relatively good. It's not perfect, there's things that I might look to change, but relatively good control in terms of how he uses his strides, and that's something that we will look at in just a second. Another example here, this athlete, less effective. Again, we'll break this down, but generally there's less stride control here and there's less affordance control here, meaning that when he gets to this final plant step, he ends up in quite a precarious position despite the fact that he's actually tried to use more strides during entry to try and make it better. So you can watch these videos and obviously draw your own conclusions. There's lots of other things that I would look at in terms of technical model analysis, of course, but I'm going to really try to just focus you here on the braking step control and this entry. Okay, we won't worry too much about much wider than that. So if we break down the execution from the player in blue, 5 hard braking steps. The 6th step is this final plant step. And then where you see I've highlighted this number 7, that's more where we've got the full absorption of the plant step and then beginning to exit. So trying to get back into a sprint position to exit that position. Now, I'll come back to these last couple of frames, these last couple of steps, and look at the key positions or a couple of very simple technical checkpoints. But if we do the same again with the second demonstration, now all of a sudden we haven't got 5 hard braking steps, we've now got 6 braking steps, and even though there's an extra braking step, when he gets to this fully absorbed position on this plant, we don't end up in a position which is as effective as what we really would like it to be. So you can go through each one of these, and I wouldn't overanalyze each one of these positions too much. Start from the end and work your way backwards. So don't start looking at step 1, etc., until you know whether that plant step and that exit has been executed effectively. That's where our start point is, and we almost reverse engineer our way back from it. So if we just zoom in on these last couple of strides, we have got the end of the penultimate step when the plant step is just beginning to make contact, like an initial contact of the final foot. And then we've also got the next frame, which is more that full absorption, full weight acceptance of that final plant step. So the next frame on the last picture for both of these athletes, they are beginning to re-accelerate. So this is the initial contact of the final step and then the end of the final step of the braking component. Now what you see quite clearly when you look at this is the position that the penultimate step is in. The most simple technical marker that I could give you, alongside some broader things like lowering our centre of mass down, but one of the important things is just what position is the shin angle of the penultimate step when the plant step has finally hit the ground. So when the final step has hit the ground and has finished braking, you can then look at what that penultimate step has done, look at the position it's in to identify whether it has actually been a big contributor, an effective contributor, and really where the flaws in the movement began to be. Athlete in blue on the right hand side, penultimate step shin angle is still facing in the direction that he came from, which is now the direction that he's trying to go in. Good contact on the ground, relatively good alignment between the shin and the torso, and that allows him to produce an optimized exit velocity and exit position. The other example on the left hand side, all of a sudden we don't have that same good control over that shin angle, meaning this penultimate step has hit the ground. We see how this shin angle is much more vertical. The penultimate step has hit the ground, but their centre of mass has continued to roll over the top of them, still got too much momentum. That has meant that the plant step has got to take a really heavy load, produce lots of work, and be really, really demanded. And then that means that their exit is going to be slower. There's going to be less of a kind of a sagittal plane sprinting based exit that we want. And it mainly comes down to the fact that what's happened in the penultimate step, and what's happened in the steps preceding that has not been effective enough to optimize that final position in order to try and reduce risk and optimize performance. So that's the simplest thing to look at, in combination with things like lowering our center of mass and having a nice hip dominant movement strategy, is what kind of angle is this penultimate step shin in? Is that shin facing more towards the vertical direction? Or is the shin still facing back in towards the direction that it came from? Look for that, and look for that general lower limb alignment. What you can see is we see in our paw example on the left hand side, we don't have the femur aligned with the direction of the foot. We don't have the lower leg or the general lower body aligned with the position of the torso. We have got everything being saved to an extent by this final foot contact. But the final foot contact should be fast ground contact time, should be stiff, and should be propulsive back into the new direction. But our example on the left here really failed to do that because of how he has distributed work and how he has decelerated on the strides approaching this position, whereas the example on the right hand side is much more effective. Good work distribution controls velocity well enough so that when that plant step hits the ground, position's maintained, exit can be optimized. So I said with our analysis, we essentially want to work our way backwards. The first question we ask is, has the athlete got to the plant step, and is the plant step executed with minimal yielding, meaning minimal continued triple flexion and eccentric demand and minimal sway of the center of mass into the direction we don't want to move in, and has it been done with a relatively fast ground contact time? Ultimately, if it has, then great, we move ourselves on and we start talking about what the next stage looks, what the exit starts to look like. And the key there being, we want to try and exit back into a sprint position as best we possibly can. That's our kind of the simple way for us to look for things. And if it has, then we go, okay, great. They've got to that good plant position. They've got to a good exit. Therefore, we can just try to optimize things by adding some variability. But if they've got a good plant step, but they don't get into an optimized exit position, then we start to think about ensuring that we can develop the right kind of propulsive rotational exit qualities that we want in order to be effective in a wider variety of situations. Whereas if we go back to that plant step and actually there's lots of yielding, so there's lots of center of mass sway, there's a really long labored ground contact time, then okay, we don't move forwards to the exit, we move our way backwards, and we now start thinking about that penultimate step position. Once again, have they got to the point where they've maintained shin angle in that penultimate step as a really simple technical marker? If they have, then okay, great. That just means that they've hit a good position, and they've maintained that good position, but they've maybe just not controlled their velocity the way that they needed to. They've managed to hold it together, but they're just doing that with a little bit too much speed. Whereas if they can't do that, then you've really clearly got a lack of appropriate work distribution across different steps. They're relying on that plant step and for that last case or that last ditch help, when really they need to have learned to brake effectively and control momentum more effectively over the strides entering that position. So what we essentially have here is we essentially have these 4 different kind of situations, whether they have got to the plant step effectively, and actually what the following situation or the following stage looks like, on whether they have not got to the plant step effectively, and what the preceding stage, that penultimate step, begins to look like. So if we just focus in now and think more practically, and we take those actions that were in bold on the bottom of the last slide, if we think that they've done the plant step and that exit position quite effectively, we just start thinking about adding variability, optimizing positions, and really starting to look at developing transfer and developing good problem solving. To do that, there's a range of different activities and different things that we can begin to put in place. If we think that the issue is more related to their exit and their ability to get back into the sagittal plane so that they can really get back into an acceleration position, then again we start thinking about training interventions and drills that are going to begin to really challenge them to execute that part of the movement. If we think that it's more about work distribution across strides, again, remember, one of my real key core components within my philosophy, then again, we start thinking about types of training that actually start to challenge an athlete to brake on the right steps, do lots of work on a left leg, but then leave the right leg to be a little bit more stiff and passive. And we deliberately challenge them to learn how to do that, turning left, turning right from different speeds and 2 different angles. If we think the main area of focus is actually that they need to develop better affordance-based control, not attempt to cut to angles when they're moving just way too fast, or they're getting to good positions but they're just not producing enough braking force early enough, meaning that we eventually end up in a suboptimal exit, then again, there's a range of different things that we would actually try to get them to do, or that we could try and challenge them with to develop those qualities. Now there's loads and loads of options here. Okay, each one of these kind of different situations or maybe different profiles that athletes have, you can see that there's a range of different things that we could give them. But the key thing that I want you to consider is actually if we start looking at each one of these, we start to see common themes. So I've highlighted some here in grey and I've highlighted some here in dark blue. Now when you look at what's highlighted, what you should begin to see is you should begin to see similar themes. You should see things that are in dark blue are all got kind of following the same kind of thought process, and things that are highlighted or things that are circled in grey, again, are following a similar kind of thought process. And this is where, for me, these key skills of developing work distribution across strides and developing some good affordance-based control and understanding of their own capability at speed and different angles, those are core skills and core competencies that we need to develop that will transfer to pretty much all of our angles and all of our different multi-directional agility-based situations. So if we take those 2 different kind of circle colors, our dark blue examples were all variations related to challenging an athlete's ability to distribute work across different strides. They were for slightly different phases of the movement, or potentially for slightly different reasons, but I'm just trying to develop that skill. 2 steps to brake and a plant, 3 steps to brake and a plant, on your left leg, on your right leg, to a 90-degree angle, to a 180-degree angle, whatever that might be. And the way that I do that is about constraining what they can actually do. So I spoke about this lots in my practical presentation, where instead of just giving somebody a task of run to a line or go to that cone and come back, when they can choose any step strategy, any braking strategy that they like, and actually they might not really understand why they are ending up in what feels like a suboptimal position, instead of letting them do whatever they want and maybe not developing the skills and just providing exposure, we should deliberately coach them and deliberately use it as an opportunity to teach them how to use their strides effectively and actually what these steps are potentially going to look like. So for example, the most simplest version is, instead of asking somebody to just produce a sprint and then stop on the line in front of them, give them a constraint of how many steps they're allowed to stop in. It might be 2, that's a very high deceleration challenge, meaning they'll have to start from a very low speed. And you might say you've got 4 steps to stop or 5 steps to stop, and that much more suits being closer to that higher sprinting velocity. Because when that happens, they understand I have to stop in 2 steps or I have to stop in 3 steps. They connect their understanding to actually what their strides are doing and how much deceleration has happened on each one to allow a good final stopping position, normally in a split stance. But what they'll also do is they'll start thinking about, well, how fast am I going? If I'm going really quickly and the constraint is I have to stop in 2 steps, they'll identify, man, 2 steps is, an X amount of distance for them. I can't stop if I'm moving this fast. That's them developing that affordance-based control, but they are mainly developing their ability to use their strides effectively. If I've got 3 steps and I'm running at this kind of speed, I need to have a really hard braking first step and then use the second and the third to come back down to that final position. And add variations to that. Constrain how they actually come to a stop to force them into using new skills and developing new competencies, but then change the approach distances. They start thinking about speed more, using more strides. Change the angle that they're trying to cut to afterwards. Change the position they're trying to decelerate into. Instead of a split stance, rotate 90 degrees to stop in this kind of half 180 degree turn stance. But the key thing is that they are focusing on how their strides are working. They're now starting to learn, I'm really not very comfortable on my left leg or on my right leg. If I'm moving this fast, I need to use 3 or 4 steps to stop, which means I can't produce really large cuts. And then you'll start to see what they're really competent with. They'll start to understand where they need to build improvements, and you can systematically over time just begin to progress that with higher speeds, less step numbers, or higher speeds and more step stopping numbers in order to just challenge overall physical output. And then everything that was circled in grey was less about actually developing that work distribution and developing the braking capability on each step. It became a little bit more broad, and it became a little bit more about affordances and deliberate variation. So systematically making changes in order to try and develop the athlete's understanding of what they're good at, what they're not good at, what they're capable of or not capable of, and doing that in a way which challenges them to develop the skills but choose the right solutions to the problems that they have in front of them. So the way that you'd look to do that would be a strategic manipulation of all of the variables that contribute towards how fast or how much distance they need to brake to be in a position to reaccelerate. So again, change approach distance, change angle, change the perceptual complexity if it's reactive, 1 player, 2 player, etc. Change the angle that they need to exit to. But ultimately, you're trying to stimulate an athlete's thinking. So instead of them just kind of mentally switching off and doing the same thing over and over again, they get a clearer understanding and they begin to learn that if I go this fast, these are my options. If I go this fast, my options on my left side are different to the options on my right side. And providing variation, getting them to problem solve, they'll begin to understand their own affordances, select better solutions, and probably use movements on pitch or on court that are more effective than their original ones. Now you can see between these two things that clearly there is a crossover between the two, and yes, there absolutely is. One is just slightly more physical dominant, coordination and physical skills. The other one is slightly more broad and slightly more a combination of this perceptual understanding and actually their selection of what they are going to do to try and solve the situation that is in front of them. But the core message for me is develop these two core skills and make sure that whenever you've got your multi-directional sessions, whenever you've got agility-based training, change of direction training, or even just some linear training that's got some deceleration capabilities in it, Just make sure that you are teaching them skills. You're not just exposing them to really basic repeated movements. Instead of stop on the line and go around the cone, teach them one of the methods that they can use to try and do it. That might be a hard brake and then a plant to re-accelerate. If you are teaching curves, same principle, do a curve in 4 steps instead of just letting them chop their feet around and choose a potentially suboptimal and comfortable strategy that doesn't lead to development. Hope you found that interesting. Those for me are very easy to implement practical tips that can have really big impacts. And those 2 concepts of work distribution and affordance control are big rocks for me in my general philosophy of how I kind of coach and develop this stuff. If you're interested in learning more, because there's a million more things to start to talk about, defensive one-on-ones, etc., then I run a change of direction and agility course, which you can just drop me a line and I'll send you some information about. But we talk through everything from profiling, task analysis, ACL injury mitigation, deceleration, technical models in more detail, optimizing one-to-ones, and generally understanding all of our change of direction and agility based skills, coaching challenges in much, much more depth and detail.